And so that was really interesting to see how much entrepreneurs would open up when you just said, I'm here to help. When you tell me there's a problem, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and help. I'm not going to ask you, what are you going to do about it? Right?
Hey everyone, welcome back to our new episode. We are Nora and Lane, the host of MPods, the podcast where we interview the innovators, entrepreneurs, and investors that have emerged from the University of Michigan. Today, we are really happy to have Cindy Padnos as our seventh guest speaker on this episode. Cindy Padnos is a graduate from the University of Michigan's Residential College. Cindy is currently the founder and managing director of Illuminate Ventures. She focuses primarily in the B2B cloud and mobile computing sectors, with a particular emphasis on SaaS applications and platforms, solutions leveraging data for business impact. Cindy serves as a board director for several Illuminate portfolio companies. 3 of her prior investments have exited successfully via IPO, and 8 more via strategic acquisitions. Cindy is a longtime advocate for diversity in the tech ecosystem, having published one of the first white papers on the topic more than 10 years ago.
Yeah, so that's like a basic description from our side, but we're also curious, do you want to share more of your story besides that?
Well, it's a long story. As you heard, I've been at this more than 25 years. So, in my career, I've had the opportunity to be, I started out in a very large corporation in the telecommunications industry. So I went from large corporate America next into management consulting, where I had the really wonderful opportunity to see a whole variety of different business models, not just one company's view of how business should get done. So I would say that was an advantage of that, but also it gave me a taste for having the opportunity to learn new things every day. Because every client we worked with, every new technology that we were asked to work with meant we had to learn something new really quickly. And that was fun. So I got a taste for that in consulting. Then I moved into startups. By that time, I had moved to the Bay Area from the East Coast. And honestly, it was like really reinvigorating to be inside of businesses where, everybody was after the same goal. They were smaller. It was easier to communicate. And I had the opportunity to be part of taking one company public, and then decided that I really had no more excuses. It was time for me to found my own company, which turned out to be a really interesting, very early SaaS software company, software as a service company in the procurement space that was acquired 3 years later by a public company. And that's eventually, finally, when I turned to venture. I will tell you, I'm not sure that any step in my career did I have completely planned in advance. I didn't have this, some people think about having a career path and a career plan, and every step of the way is orchestrated. I didn't do things that way. That doesn't make it right or wrong. I just didn't do things that way. And a lot of what I did, really ended up happening because in part of having self-confidence, I guess I would say, that I could try lots of new things. Having a really supportive husband as well that said, yeah, go, that's what you want to do, go do it. And also, having gained an education that was quite broad in scope, both at the University of Michigan and then at Carnegie Mellon University's Tepper School of Business as well. So it was after all of those other things that I was still a founder at heart, but I wanted to start a venture capital firm, not start another company.
Yeah, a lot of guest speakers we interview with, they also have some nonlinear careers like you. They didn't expect they will do venture capital until they actually do this. But before that, later success in those large startup and your venture capital firms, do you want to talk more about your time in Michigan and how those time help you for your later career trajectory? Do you want to recall any stories or projects you did in undergrad?
Well, I was a bit of an anomaly in a lot of ways. Well, first of all, I was in the residential college, which allowed you effectively design your own major. And so I took all sorts of classes, but even more than that, I got super lucky because I wanted to be, I thought my end goal, this is how crazy I was, oh, I'm going to do international business. Why did I think that? Why? Because my father did a lot of business that was both domestic and international. And even when I was a young teenager, when I was 15, he had done this exchange with a family in Europe where I went and lived for one summer with a French family, and then their eldest daughter came and lived with us for the next summer. And so I was crazy enough to think that because I had grown up in a family-owned business and worked summers there, most of the time from when I was a teenager, and I was gonna therefore then go learn foreign languages, and I would do international business. I didn't think about the fact that maybe I needed to understand mathematics more deeply or economics more deeply or all sorts of other classes that eventually I did end up taking. But it literally wasn't until I had the opportunity to go to France for a year and study at the University of Aix-en-Provence, which is in the south of France and has an exchange program, I think still today, but at the time, where Wisconsin University and Michigan teamed up, each selected, but because every single class I took would count towards my major, because I was a language major and they were all at a French university, so all my classes were in French, I could take any class I wanted. That was just crazy. So I took economics, I took political science, and I discovered I was in classes with all sorts of undergraduate business school students in France, which was not what my degree at Michigan was going to be, right? And yet it was really that experience that ended up causing me to realize that I wanted to get a master's in business, that I needed to do that, that if I truly wanted to work in international business, I had a lot to learn. It wasn't just about growing up in a family-owned business or any of those kinds of things. But going back to on campus, I mean, the residential college was a fantastic experience because it did allow you to take classes all over campus and meet many different types of students. At that time, the university still had the Interflex program, which was a 6-year medical school. You came in and you went through undergrad and medical school in 6 years. And we all shared that East Quad together. So we were all together there. So I met some of my best friends to this day are actually physicians, not liberal arts undergrads like I was, because we shared that dorm together. So it was a great experience.
Sounds like you have chosen different areas of classes and interdisciplinary study, and that's really amazing. And I also noticed that you cover a lot of different areas in your later careers, like startups, management consulting, corporate executive, which apply to your founding of Illuminate Venture later. So do you want to tell us more story behind your founding about Illuminate Venture?
Yeah, I had the good fortune after the company I founded was acquired. That was a company called Vivant. I had that really amazing opportunity that I could apprentice myself to some of the best VC partners out there. And I hadn't planned to do it, but shortly after my company was acquired, 9/11 happened. And the world kind of fell apart in the venture community. There was a shortage of experienced founders, and there were a lot of very young, inexperienced founders in companies that were venture backed. And so my phone started ringing from all of these venture capitalists saying, would you come in and help? Would you come in and be a coach or a mentor to this CEO? Or would you come in and be interim CEO of this company and all of that kind of thing? And I basically said, I just have 2 criteria. One of them is I have no interest in coming into a company that you plan to shut down. So you've got to assure me that you're willing to fund this company, going forward, that this is a company you really want to help, to succeed. And the second one is I want to learn your business. And so I want to be invited to attend your partner meetings and just see what it means to be a VC. And they were willing to do that. And that was just a phenomenal experience. And I did that with people at Scale Venture Partners and USVP and Benchmark and more David Au. And I just, it was kind of like my consulting experience where I got to see not how lots of companies did business, but how lots of VC firms did business. And it was different. They weren't all the same. And in that process, I ran into a guy that I had worked with in management consulting. He was a partner in a firm. They ended up inviting me to join them as a partner, which I did. And then that gave me the opportunity to actually start building a track record as an investor. And I invested with that team for 4 years. I invested into 4 companies and what was then called, very traditional Series A financings. The seed rounds and the pre-seed rounds we have today didn't exist because all of that was happening before the public cloud existed. That's hard for you guys to imagine, I suspect, but imagine you've got to set up all your own servers, buy all of your own database licenses, buy all of the software development tools. They're not available from Amazon, for $1 an hour. You now have to come up with $1 million to buy all these things and the servers to load all the software onto. So by the time you do all of that, you have to raise outside capital. Founders couldn't just start companies. And that had been true of the company I founded as well. There was no public cloud. So in that firm, we had 2 different teams, one that was focused on B2B software, another one on B2C, a business to consumer. I was so lucky. I got to do both, which I thought was super cool because I knew nothing about the B2C world. My whole career had been on the enterprise software B2B side of things. Again, another learning experience. But after 4 years, I realized I truly was an entrepreneur and I wanted to go found my own firm. And the motivation for Illuminate was several things. One, the public cloud had happened by then. And it was very clear to me that people didn't need a traditional Series A, which was $3 or $4 million to start a business anymore. In fact, the way I looked at it was like, if they aren't willing to just bootstrap with no capital and use their own credit card to, get some of that, literally $1 an hour cloud computing resource, they're lazy, So I want to see people who built a prototype, who started doing that kind of thing. That wasn't what Series A investors did. So I wanted a company that would do that. There wasn't anyone exclusively focused in the B2B space. That's what I wanted to do as well. And part of that was these new seed stage funds. They were called micro VC firms back then. They were all started by guys, every one of them. And they were all started by guys who'd been in the consumer internet world, not B2B, because they'd come out of an exit at Facebook or an exit at Google or something like that. And I think people didn't really believe you could start a B2B software company inexpensively. They thought you had to spend a lot of money on marketing and sales and all these other things, which turns out you can figure out ways around that too. And then the third thing I think was very simple, that as a woman founder, CEO myself, I knew it had been harder for me to figure out how to raise capital for my startup than for any of the guys I knew. And part of that was my own network. I didn't have the same networks that they had. I didn't have a bunch of VC friends. The numbers at that time were even worse than today. But at that point, I literally think it was 3 schools made up 50% of all the venture capitalists in North America. And that was Harvard and Stanford and Wharton and maybe Berkeley was on there. I'm not sure. But it was a very, very short list. I went to 2 great schools. I went to Michigan and Carnegie Mellon, but I wasn't at one of those. So I just didn't know these people. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't a guy who would hang out with them and play basketball after work or whatever. Anyway, I didn't have that network. And I wanted to start creating a more level playing field for women entrepreneurs and for other diverse founders as well. And I figured I didn't have to use that as a mandate. I just needed to remove the barriers. And then I would have a different kind of deal flow, which would actually advantage me and advantage our firm as well. So that was the motivation. Mm-hmm. Getting started was hard though.
Very interesting and inspiring. You mentioned before you started Illuminate Ventures, you did a startup and successfully sold it to other firms. So I wonder, do you think it's that necessary to become a good founder in order to become a good investor? And for your experience, how does your startups experience help you with your investment career?
Well, first of all, I'll say I don't think there's any mandatory requirements. The road to venture capital is as varied and unique as the number of VCs that are out there. There isn't a dedicated career path. There are all sorts of different ways that people become venture capitalists. I will say, I think there have been some huge advantages to me as a VC from each of my experiences. From the corporate world, I learned how to operate in that environment and sell to large corporations. I was in sales. And so, understanding how sales to big companies works helps every one of my startups as well, right? And the network and the contacts and relationships and introductions I could make because of that. Having been a consultant, I learned to multitask. I learned to learn new technologies and new markets really quickly. Again, if you're a VC, you have to assess a new market and a new team and a new technology, almost overnight, all the time. It's part of the fun of it. It's part of the challenge of it. But again, so I think large corporate and consulting, they were helpful to me as well. But I will say the third piece, the being in a startup, not necessarily having to be the founder, but in a startup, if you're going to do seed stage investing or pre-seed or early stage, I think it's super helpful because these founders don't just need our capital, they need our know-how and our network. And that's what we want to offer them. And if I don't have all those other experiences, how can I offer them, right? So on the other hand, I think if you're doing late stage investing, series B and beyond, growth stage and late stage investing, it's a different set of skills. I'm not sure I would even be a great, I'm sure I wouldn't be a great growth stage investor. It's much more about the financial metrics. It's much more about many other things that you need to know and assess in the diligence process and after you've invested than at our stage. I think there are backgrounds that can be well suited to venture from every kind of career, but I think there's a definite benefit to having been part of a startup, walked in the shoes of those founders that I talked to, lived through the peaks and valleys of what it's like to be in a startup for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of the other guest speakers that we interviewed on this podcast who did the early stage VC investments also did the startups before they became the investor. And you also mentioned that before you started Illuminate Ventures, you didn't have that VC network and the VC industry was pretty much dominated by those three big schools. And I know you mentioned that you worked with the Skill Venture Partners, USVPs, Outlook Ventures, etc. before you started the Illuminate Ventures. So what did you learn when you worked with those people from different venture firms, and how did that help with founding the Illuminate Ventures?
Yeah, it's a great question. I learned so many things. Sitting in and even just the fundamentals of how a venture capital firm measures performance. I remember someone asking me once, do you understand how we're measured by our investors? And I stepped back and I said, well, return. So that was the only answer, right? Return, your returns. And they said, there's much more to how they do the math, and explained to me how an internal rate of return was how some investors measured your performance, meaning the time value of money is taken into consideration, whereas others really just care about the multiple. It was the first time I ever heard terminology. And by the way, certain investors, meaning the limited partner investors who fund the venture capital firms, have really different viewpoints about this. I remember talking about IRR, internal rate of return, in one of these sessions, and this person turning to me and saying, Cindy, you can't eat IRR. You can have a great IRR and only have a 2x return if they return the money in 6 weeks. And I laughed and I said, yeah, I had one of those. I had one of my first investments was literally over 1,000% IRR, but it's because it was a good return. It was like a 3x return, but it happened really quickly. But, for a lot of investors, they understand that multiple matters as well, meaning in the end, it's still 10x, not 3x, right? So it's super interesting, super interesting. I learned about the importance of communicating very, very clearly with entrepreneurs about what your expectations are. I grew up in the Midwest. My integrity and my relationship with people is one of the most important things to me. but never until I had this experience understood how valuable it could be to just communicate a few things really directly to an entrepreneur. For example, I learned this as an operator, as a CEO as well, but people reinforced it. You never want to walk into a board meeting with surprises. Pick up the phone, send an email, do whatever you need to do, but communicate with the people in advance of board meetings and make that interaction valuable to both parties in the conversation in a way that you can actually help someone rather than just listen and hear about a situation perhaps after the fact when you can't do anything to help any longer. And so that was really interesting to see how much entrepreneurs would open up when you just said, I'm here to help. When you tell me there's a problem, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and help. I'm not going to ask you, what are you going to do about it? Right. So that was a really interesting experience. There's so much I learned there. These are Rory O'Driscoll at Scale Venture Partners is one of the best VCs I know. Nancy Schoendorf from More Davidoff, the same. These were just very generous people willing to help me learn the trade effectively.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for sharing those lessons. And speaking of returns, we're really curious, which investment do you think is your most successful one? And do you want to share that with us?
Well, that's like asking someone who's your favorite child, right? It depends on how you measure success, okay? We have an investment philosophy that means we have a set of criteria that we really want to be able to leverage over and over again to invest in the same belief system of what is a good investment. And our fundamental philosophy is supported so beautifully by one of the investments that we're in today. It hasn't had an exit yet, so it's hard to say this is our best investment ever, but it's really unique. So we've always said that we wanted to open the door wider and create a level playing field, right? That those were sort of fundamentals of our firm. And that means that we're willing to look at companies that look a little bit different from what other VCs consider, sort of the pattern recognition, perfect company. We've also always said that we want to invest in what we call further along companies. That can mean a lot of different things. We've invested in companies that were spin-outs from large corporations or entirely bootstrapped by being an IT service company or other things, and a variety of different ways. And this company I'm going to mention is called Content Stack. So Content Stack is founded by a team of non-white founders who happen to be husband and wife, two of the three founders, who had bootstrapped their initial business by starting as an IT service business and seeing the same problem needing to be resolved over and over again for their customers. And so they stepped back and they said, we're pretty smart people. We understand that an IT service company is valued at 1x revenue, roughly. But a SaaS company is valued at, today you might say 6x revenue. Back then it was 10 to 15 times revenue. And hopefully it will be again, but a multiple of whatever an IT service business is. We want to spin this product out. We want to create a SaaS software company, and we're going to grow this thing to the moon because this is a huge market. It's a company that's in the area that we call digital experience management. They were one of the very first headless content management systems. And what that means is you can create content once and deploy it anywhere. Omnichannel. Doesn't matter if it's your smartwatch or the Jumbotron at the theater or the monitor, in your office or any device or even chat or whatever other type of content you might have. Well, not so long ago, meaning really only 2 or 3 years ago, you would create content over and over and over again for every separate channel that you wanted to deploy it on. You'd use Joomla for the web or maybe Adobe CMS if you were a really high-end company. And this company had a vision of eliminating all of that extra engineering work, all of that extra marketing time, and not just the cost of all of that, but the delay of getting new content out, into your market was what they hope to address. So we looked at it and said, oh my gosh, this is huge. And they've already built a product, and they validated it with customers, and they were running at nearly $1 million in recurring revenue, and had a team that had all worked together for multiple years. This is a further along company with a lot of advantages. What a lot of other people saw was an Indian husband and wife team, full stop, go no further. Mm-hmm. And despite the fact that this was a team, that this was their third company together, first two they had sold successfully, and they'd been married for a very long time. And she was the CEO, he was the CTO, and it was very clear that he deferred to her on the business decisions. That prevented most VCs from wanting to be a part of this company. As a result, we led the round, we syndicated the investment actually with a family office. That's unusual, right? Yeah. Let's fast forward. This is now a little less than 5 years later. That company has grown their revenue more than 50-fold. They have raised an additional over $100 million beyond the original $2.5 million that we put in with this one other group. They have basically achieved what the industry now calls a dragon status, which means they return the entire fund. One company returns our entire fund too. And they will likely return a multiple of that over time. They're still growing and prospering and have a whole long way to go. The investors who followed us because in 1 year's time, they were able to achieve 4x revenue growth, 400% revenue growth. And they did that with only $2.5 million in financing, and still had $1 million in the bank when they raised that next round. And then it became a feeding frenzy. Every VC wanted to invest. It was very competitive. And they ended up choosing not the highest valuation, but the team they most preferred to work with. And that was Insight Partners, one of the largest and most respected venture firms in the world.
Yeah.
So that's an example of what you can do when you think different.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a good point that you made is really trying to kind of uncover the page and dig into the story behind it. I think not only the founders have unique experience and they hit all the finance metrics, but the reason that why you can fund this opportunity is really about you say the thing behind the scene. And yeah, and also congratulations on the big returns.
Well, it's not a return yet, but I know it.
Yeah, on the big figures. A follow-up question on that is, you mentioned that Illuminate Ventures looks at a lot of different areas than other VC firms. So I wonder, what is the investment strategies or thesis for Illuminate Ventures, and what makes the Illuminate Ventures different from other early stage?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I mentioned already, our fundamental thesis is around further along companies. And I described one example. This was a company that had been an IT service business first. But sometimes founders do it using SBIR grants, government, grants that are non-dilutive. Sometimes they spin out from large companies. There are so many ways that founders can get further along today, that's just a fundamental piece of what we look for. And the world continues to evolve. There's going to be more ways over time. And it's kind of like what I was saying when SaaS still first existed, when the public cloud, Amazon first existed, then I was like, okay, I want people who are willing to be scrappy and work hard and build something first. Now we look at it and say, oh my gosh, there's so much that they can do before they need to raise capital. Let's see if they're willing to do it and be scrappy and do those things. And so we're always looking for that. We're also, another fundamental for us is we invest only in the B2B software world, business to business software. We invest only at seed stage, not pre-seed, not Series A. We reserve capital to follow on to what investment we make to follow on into the next round. But once they meet that first criteria further along, the next thing we're looking for is, can they show demonstrable and rapid ROI? Because Jennifer, my partner, Jennifer Savage, she and I have known each other forever. She was the VP of products in the company I founded, went on to some other really successful operating roles inside of DocuSign and Smartsheet, and joined me as my partner 5 years ago. So we like to laugh and say, well, this is our second and our last time working together. And people will look at us and say, what? And we say, because we're never going to do anything else. This is us forever. So anyway, she and I have been operators, a large part of our careers, and her, she has been much longer than I. And we know that if you can show rapid ROI in a B2B company over the last 2 years, a lot of companies have found it hard to sell, hard to raise capital, had to do massive layoffs and all of the rest. These companies that can go in and show, it doesn't matter if it's a small business, an SMB, or a large enterprise, if they can show a way for that company to either increase top line revenue or reduce costs nearly overnight, it changes everything, right? They can, even if they have no budget, they can find a way to get a budget. And so that's a fundamental for us as well. The other thing that we've done, I think that's been, that makes us different. You asked about what makes us different. I think those two things are just sort of fundamental investing strategy. The other thing that really makes us different is we've started from day one building what we think of as a platform. It's not just Jennifer and myself. That platform includes something we call our Business Advisory Council and our class year internship network. The Business Advisory Council started with 8 or 9 people, when I founded the firm, and today's 45 people. Those 45 people all come from one way or another the B2B tech world. They have sat on more than 250 private company boards across just 45 people, and they sit on over 100 public company boards today. What's that mean? That means they can make great introductions on deal flow. It means they can make great introductions to the first customers and business partners for all of these companies, and even channel partners over time. They've helped us with M&A strategy on companies, including one of our companies that was acquired by one of our advisors sat on the board of the company. Unexpectedly, they had a different offer, and she helped them get introduced into that CEO, and boom, we had a different and better offer almost overnight. They've been an incredible resource to us, and most of them are investors in our funds, so they have skin in the game, and they really want to be helpful. But I will tell you, at least that group and the student group, we go out of our way to ensure diversity. Both of those groups are 75% diverse intentionally. Both of them are more than half women intentionally. And that's a part of our deal flow strategy to expand, the kinds of things that we see. Our student internship program is master's level students at some of the top schools around the country. We've done that for 10 years as well. We've now had more than 100 students graduate, if you want to think of it that way, through that program. And they do like such an array of different, just before this call, I was on a call with one of our women students from Carnegie Mellon from the Tepper School. And she and I were going through a whole analysis of what's going on in the venture capital industry and putting together a presentation on that, like what's changing given the macro economy and the shortage of exits and all of these kinds of things. Super interesting.
Yeah.
But last year she was working on a project that was for one of our portfolio companies, helping them do a whole pricing strategy. So they are amazing resources while they work with us, but then they're scouts for us when they leave and send us deal flow from, wherever the jobs that they take after they've graduated through our programs. So I think those are things that make, us different as a firm and help us expand our network and our reach and our support for our portfolio company.
Yeah, absolutely. Hope we can contribute to the internship program and the deal flow later.
All right. Love that.
It's really impressive that I can see you are actually helping some women students to break into the venture capital world, which is dominated by male for a really long time. And I think Illuminate is very unique because you and Jennifer, the leadership team are all women. So how did you break that barriers in venture capital with gender side? I believe there's a lot of difficulty, but do you want to share some?
Well, look, it was not easy to launch a venture capital firm. I didn't have those contacts and connections with limited partner investors either. And so, I chose to do it initially as a solo GP, general partner. Jennifer joined me 5 years ago. Best investment, I guess I think, what I ever made. So when you asked me before, that's what I should have. Jennifer, she's my very best investment. But not true. She invested in me and the firm in the same way that I invested in her, which makes it, pretty great. But, I had a very broad network, having been a founder myself and having been part of several startups. One we had taken public where I was the VP of marketing, a couple of others where we were acquired in good M&A exits. You build a network. And from that, you build relationships in your community, which helps you generate great deal flow. And if you can show people, which the opportunity that the team at the prior firm I was with, Illuminate Ventures, gave me, that you can make investments and show good returns. I invested in 4 companies there. 2 of those went public. One of those had a very successful M&A exit. That was the really high IRR company we talked about. And the 4th one was an outright failure. Just, the product didn't work. It was a very deep tech, great computing platform that didn't perform at the level it needed to for people to choose to buy it. And so I had all of that experience and some track record. And I had this small, but still, group of believer advisors who was saying, you can go do this. And by the way, that first group of advisors, I would say probably half of them joined because they wanted to see a woman doing what I was doing. They wanted to be supportive and helpful. 2/3 of the people in our advisory group I had never met before I reached out to them to ask them to be advisors. I'm talking about people like Sarah Fryer, who's the CEO of Nextdoor today. She was the head of software research at Goldman Sachs at the time. Someone introduced me. I went and sat in her office, and in one day, she said, count me in. One meeting, so people were very, very generous and supportive of helping me to get the firm started.
You mentioned the investment that you failed. Out of those 4, there's one failure. It's also very common in venture capital industry that so many fails, up and downs. So I wonder, could you share a specific time or instance where a failure that came into a experience of learning and growth, and what do you learn from that?
Well, I have to say, every failure we've had, I believe I've learned from. That the typical failure rate in seed stage funds is 30 to 40%. Sit back a minute, 30 to 40%. It's a big number. Ours on average across our 3 funds is a little over 20%. But, the one that I mentioned in the first firm that I was with, that was a really interesting problem. It was deep tech. I'm not a deep tech person. So I brought someone in from the outside to help assess it. We were co-investing with a very established, well-known firm, with a guy before and since had a good track record, and they brought the deal to me. So we were kind of counting on some of their due diligence. The one thing I'll never forgive myself for was that the day that they did the technical diligence, and it had to be done quickly because it was a really competitive deal, I couldn't be there. And my 2 other partners from the firm were there. They attended. They did this technical diligence. We brought in an outside expert, and they all agreed the thing was going to work. So to this day, I think, well, if I had been there, would I have heard something that would have clued me in that this was never going to work? Probably not. Okay. But I think the fundamental is you can't outsource your due diligence at seed stage. You really just personally need to be involved in some of these things and be there to ask the right questions, even though I had 2 partners more experienced than I was that were sitting in on the session. It was my deal. I should have been there. And that the risk was that we would lose the deal, and we had been asked to make a decision very quickly. So that's the second half. Walk away. And I can't tell you how many deals we've walked away from since where I said, we're not going to be pressured into a decision. That's not how we operate. We do our full due diligence.
It reminds me another guest speaker on our podcast before called David Horowitz. He also mentioned that how important it is to do your job on due diligence. You can't pass it to somebody else or rely on someone. Totally. Yeah. I think unless we always want to hear about some of your advice to the young people, especially for students that are studying at the University of Michigan.
Well, Michigan is such a great school. I think it's a great time to, really learn from the changes that are taking place in the world today. Some of that, of course, is AI. You can't get through a conversation about anything in tech without talking about that. But I honestly believe that as much as I saw, my father adapt to everything from microwaves to iPhones, and he did, that the things that never existed in his lifetime, we're going to need to do the same. And we need to plan to do the same. All of us think right now, well, we have everything, right? There can't be anything more. Wrong answer. There's going to be more and more. And so, my recommendation to younger people is just have an open mind, explore things, believe in yourself enough to try new things. I wasn't pigeonholed into one career. If I had been, I would still be in a large corporation, my first job out of grad school. But I went from large corporate to consulting to startups to venture. And I think everyone has that kind of opportunity if they choose it.
Yeah, that really encouraged us to explore more in different areas and industries. Thanks for that advice. At the very end, we have rapid fire questions for you.
I didn't look at them, so now I better be prepared.
Thanks, you didn't look at.
I think the question is, what's your favorite book?
Oh gosh, there's a lot of great books. I think one book that really I found super interesting was something called 1491. It's the story of basically North America before Columbus arrived in 1492, supposedly. So it's all about how all of the assumptions we make and that Columbus made, and that that we hear about what civilization was like in North America before the civilized quote unquote people arrived, is wrong. About how there were amazing cities and amazing centers of learning and amazing belief systems that existed all over North America, many of which were destroyed when the conquistadors and others came here. And then everyone assumed as a result, we brought disease with us that wiped out massive numbers of people and all sorts of things. That it's just a fascinating book. It's very, very interesting.
Great. Thank you so much for recommending that book. I was looking for a book about the American history for a long time. I'm definitely going to read it.
Well, I was a dual major. I hate to tell you, or I guess it was not a dual major, but it was a minor in history. I love history too.
Glad to hear that. The last question is, what's your favorite?
Oh my gosh. So there is a guy by the name of Samir Kaji who's got the most beautiful voice of any podcaster I've ever heard. So you might listen to it for that reason, but he produces a podcast for his firm called Allocate that it brings on really knowledgeable and very giving VCs to talk about, not just VCs, but VCs and LPs, to talk about what it takes to succeed in the industry, travails that they've faced and how they've handled them. He's a great moderator, and I think his content is quite good as well. I don't listen to a lot of podcasts, I have to admit.
Yeah, I believe we have a lot to learn from that podcast. Well, I think that's all for the questions today. Thank you so much, Cindy. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Always.
Thank you so much.
Good luck, guys. Take care.
Thank you.